In this video, we'll analyze one of the most intriguing stories in medieval cartography, the saga of an island that appeared and disappeared from official maps for centuries, challenging explorers, cartographers, and even entire empires. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There was something peculiar about medieval maps, something that to contemporary eyes might seem like naivete or carelessness, but which upon closer examination reveals a much more complex layer of human history. The persistent presence of an island that shouldn't exist, an island that no explorer could consistently find, that vanished from one map only to reappear on another, described with surprising detail by people who had never set foot on its soil, and which remained recorded in official documents for over 500 years. To understand how this was possible, one must first grasp the world in which these maps were created. In the 14th century, Europe was living through an era of nautical expansion, while remaining rooted in a cosmology that blended faith, myth, and empirical observation in an almost inseparable way. The cartographers of that time were not mere technical draftsmen. They were scholars, monks, and adventurers trying to organize the visible and invisible world within the confines of a parchment. For them, the boundary between what was known and what was possible remained deliberately open. And it was in this context that, in 1325, a Catalan map today known as the Portolan of Angelino Dulcet clearly and identifiably recorded, for the first time, a circular island situated southwest of Ireland, in the Atlantic, still little explored by Europeans. The island had a name, and that name carried a promise, almost an entire mythology within itself: High Brazil. The name of Celtic origin is often associated with the Gaelic concept of a blessed land, a place of beauty and abundance that existed beyond the western waters. Some translations suggest it would mean the island of the blessed or the island of the great king, although etymologists still debate its precise origin. What is not debated is the impact this marking on the map had on the European imagination in the following centuries. What intrigued scholars of the time was not just the existence of the record, it was its consistency. Over the decades following the 1325 map, High Brazil continued to appear on cartographies produced by different authors, in different countries, with different reference sources. It appeared slightly shifted to the north in some versions, a little further south in others. Sometimes it was depicted as an almost perfectly round island, bisected by a narrow strait. Other times it emerged with more irregular outlines, but it was always there west of Ireland, waiting. The most curious thing is that in certain periods, the island simply disappeared from the maps. There was no footnote, no explanation. The next cartographer simply didn't include it, as if it had never existed. And then, decades later, another map brought it back, with the same approximate position, the same name, and in some cases, additional details about its internal geography that seemed to have sprung from nowhere. This pattern of appearance, disappearance, and reappearance was not random. It followed the rhythm of the accounts. Each time the island returned to the maps, there was a new wave of testimonies behind it. Sailors who claimed to have sighted something in the distance in the waters west of Ireland. Fishermen who described a land briefly emerging through the dense fog. Reports that circulated in the ports of Bristol, Lisbon, Genoa, and found an echo in the studies of continental cartographers. The historian and geographer William Herbert, writing in the 19th century about the island traditions of the Irish coast, observed that the persistence of High Brazil in official records for so long could not be explained solely as transcription errors or collective fantasy. There was, according to him, something concrete underpinning those accounts, something that was yet to be fully understood. And perhaps that is the most honest starting point for a serious investigation, because the story of High Brazil is not just the story of a cartographic mistake. It is the story of how human beings deal with the unknown, how they transform the inexplicable into symbol, into hope, and sometimes into a collective obsession that spans generations. In the following chapters, we will trace the historical records, the expeditions that set out in search of this illusory land, and the theories that attempted to decipher its origin. And at the end of this journey, what we discover may change the way we understand not only this mysterious point on the map, but the very nature of medieval cartography and the secrets it still holds. To understand why High Brazil exerted such a lasting fascination on the European medieval mind, we must go back even further in time, even before the 1325 map. Long before any Catalan cartographer recorded it on parchment, the island already inhabited the imagination of the Celtic populations of the Atlantic coast of Ireland. And there, it was not just a distant land. It was a symbol charged with spiritual, almost sacred meaning. In Irish Gaelic tradition, there was a belief in a place called Tir na Nog, which can be translated as the land of eternal youth. It was a kind of paradise situated beyond the waters of the Western Ocean, accessible only to the chosen, to those who had merited an existence beyond suffering and finitude. High Brazil, for many scholars, was a variation or a parallel expression of this same concept. A blessed land that existed on the border between the world of the living and something that transcended current human understanding. This mythological root is fundamental to understanding what happened next. When European navigators and merchants began to explore the North Atlantic during the 13th and 14th centuries, they carried with them not only instruments and nautical charts, but also deep layers of culture, oral tradition, and belief. And when Irish fishermen returned to port describing lands sighted in the distance, no one merely wondered where that land was. They wondered what it meant. This interweaving of the geographical and the symbolic was, to a large extent, what guaranteed High Brazil's longevity on European maps. Because the island was not just a fact to be verified or refuted, it was an idea that fulfilled a cultural and emotional function for the societies that carried it. It represented the possibility of the beyond, the existence of something greater and more beautiful than what the eyes could reach in everyday life. But what makes the story of High Brazil particularly unique is the fact that, at a certain historical moment, this idea abandoned the purely symbolic realm and began to be treated as a concrete geographical issue. And this leap, from myth to map, did not occur abruptly. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, and was sustained by a constant flow of reports that fueled the island's cartographic credibility. After the 1325 map, High Brazil reappeared in 1339 on the so-called Carta of Angelino de Dall'Orto, another Mediterranean portolan. Then it appeared in the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most sophisticated cartographic works of the Middle Ages, likely produced by Abraham Cresques, a Jewish cartographer from Mallorca, who compiled in his work the most advanced state of European geographical knowledge of his time. That High Brazil featured in this work was not a minor detail. It was a form of institutional legitimation. With each new appearance on maps, the island gained details. In some versions, it was possible to see the marking of a central channel dividing it in half, as if it were an almost artificial structure. In others, there were written references to its interior, with mentions of forests, pastures, and even constructions. These progressive additions reveal a curious process. The island was not mechanically copied from one map to another. It was reinterpreted, enriched, as if each cartographer who reproduced it were adding something gathered from new sources, new accounts, new conversations in the ports. And there were practical reasons for this. Medieval portolan charts, contrary to what many imagine, were not purely speculative works. They were instruments for nautical use, consulted by captains and merchants before undertaking voyages. For an island to appear on these documents regularly, there had to be some functional justification, some reason for the compilers of these charts to include it. The persistence of High Brazil suggests that this justification existed, even if its exact nature continues to be debated by historians. What begins to take shape, when one examines these records closely, is a self-sustaining cycle. The maps fueled expeditions. The expeditions generated new accounts. The accounts returned to the maps in the form of additional details. And thus, High Brazil consolidated itself as a stable presence in the medieval Atlantic, not by force of certainty, but by force of a persistent and productive doubt, that doubt which says, it might be there, and if it is, it must be found. This impulse, simultaneously rational and emotional, was on the verge of transforming into concrete action. In the following years, businessmen, merchants, and ship captains would begin to organize formal expeditions with a single objective: to reach the coordinates where the maps indicated High Brazil should be. What they would find, or more precisely what they would not find, would add an entirely new layer of complexity to the mystery. In the summer of 1480, a ship departed from the port of Bristol on the west coast of England, carrying provisions for a long crossing and a mission that, to today's eyes, may seem surprisingly daring for the time. Aboard, a captain named Thomas Lloyd guided the vessel westward, guided by the coordinates that known maps indicated for High Brazil. The ship's owner was a merchant named John J. Jr., a businessman with long experience in Atlantic trade and enough faith in the accounts of the island to invest considerable resources in its search. For 9 weeks, the ship scoured the waters of the North Atlantic. 9 weeks of navigation in an ocean that, by the standards of the time, was an almost absolute frontier between the known and the unknown world. Lloyd and his crew encountered adverse winds, storms, and the growing feeling of searching for something that receded with each mile sailed. In the end, the vessel returned to Bristol with no island in sight, no discovery to justify the time and resources spent. The news came to the knowledge of a customs official named John Day, who years later, in a letter addressed to Christopher Columbus himself, would mention this expedition as part of a series of searches undertaken by Bristol merchants. This letter, discovered only in the 20th century in a Spanish archive, revealed that attempts to locate High Brazil from England were much more systematic and recurrent than previously supposed. In 1481, just a year after Lloyd's return, Bristol organized a new expedition with 2 ships, the Trinity and the George. The vessels set sail again toward the western Atlantic, better equipped and with new position estimates based on available maps. The result was the same. The ships returned without finding the island, and yet Bristol's merchants did not give up. Throughout the 1480s, historical records suggest that periodic expeditions continued to be organized from the same port with the same objective. What this pattern of persistence reveals is something profoundly human. Bristol was, during that period, one of the most active and enterprising ports in Atlantic Europe. Its merchants were not men of empty dreams. They were practical traders, accustomed to calculating risks and returns. If they continued to send ships to the Atlantic in search of an island that never appeared, it was because they had concrete reasons to believe it might exist, reasons that largely stemmed from the accumulated accounts of generations of fishermen and sailors. The gap between what was sought and what was found did not seem sufficient to extinguish the conviction that High Brazil was there. It was as if the island had become, for these men, not just a geographical destination, but a matter of intellectual and commercial honor. To find it would mean confirming centuries of records, validating the maps, and reaping the economic benefits of a new route in the Atlantic. This drive from Bristol is even more significant when considering the broader historical context. We are in the 1480s, a few years before Christopher Columbus set off on his celebrated voyage in 1492. The Atlantic was on the verge of being crossed in a way that would forever change European understanding of the world, and it is possible that Bristol's expeditions, largely motivated by the search for High Brazil, played a role in this process far greater than official history usually acknowledges. Some historians, among them the researcher Alwyn Ruddock, whose notes were controversially destroyed before her death, argued that Bristol sailors had reached lands in the western Atlantic before Columbus. This hypothesis, still debated today, suggests that the search for a phantom island may have paradoxically been the engine of one of the most significant geographical discoveries in human history. What was sought was not what was found, but what was found changed the world. Meanwhile, in Ireland itself, the island continued to exert its role in the collective imagination in a completely different way. There it was not the object of commercial expeditions. It was a living part of the oral memory of coastal communities, passed down from generation to generation as a fact as natural as the tide. Fishermen from County Galway claimed to recognize the island's profile on foggy days. Elders described in detail what their parents and grandparents had told them about sightings nearby. It was as if there were 2 High Brazils coexisting, one rational, cartographic, and pursued by expeditions funded by merchants, another intuitive, oral, and lived as community memory. And between these two worlds, the mystery deepened, accumulating layers that no failed expedition could entirely dissipate. If Bristol's expeditions had failed to find High Brazil, it would be reasonable to expect the island to progressively disappear from European maps as the 15th century progressed and geographical knowledge of the Atlantic became more precise. After all, the age of great voyages was in full swing. Portuguese and Spanish were mapping the ocean with unprecedented systematicity. The world, as was said at the time, was being measured and recorded. And yet, High Brazil remained. Not only did it remain, but in certain cases it gained even more prestige. In the 16th century, when European cartography underwent one of the greatest revolutions in its history, with the advent of printing and the large-scale production of atlases and engraved maps, the island continued to appear in works produced by some of the most respected cartographers of the period. Gerard Mercator, the man who transformed the way the world was represented by developing the cylindrical projection that still bears his name today, included High Brazil in maps produced throughout his career. Abraham Ortelius, whose 1570 Theatrum Orbis Terrarum is considered the world's first modern atlas, also recorded it. These were not naive or careless men. They were rigorous intellectuals, in constant contact with the most up-to-date navigation reports available in their time. The fact that they chose to keep High Brazil in their works, even as the North Atlantic was being more frequently traversed, suggests that there was something in those reports that they considered worthy of credit. Not necessarily certainty, but a reasonable doubt, enough to justify the island's presence on the map. It is important to understand that, for the mindset of the 16th century, the absence of evidence did not automatically equate to evidence of absence. The ocean was vast, navigation instruments still had significant limitations, and the possibility that an island had been sighted and then not found again was perfectly compatible with the available nautical knowledge. There was even a natural phenomenon that sailors knew well. Certain atmospheric conditions could create optical illusions on the horizon, making masses of clouds, banks of thick fog, or even irregularities of the sea surface appear for a few moments as outlines of land. This phenomenon, now studied by meteorologists and optical physicists under the name Fata Morgana, was well documented by medieval and Renaissance navigators, albeit without modern scientific nomenclature. Some contemporary researchers argue that part of the sightings of High Brazil can be explained by this effect. The coast of Ireland, due to its particular climatic conditions, is especially prone to this type of atmospheric mirage, and the position described for High Brazil on maps coincides remarkably with the areas where such phenomena are recorded with greater frequency. But this explanation, though seductive in its scientific elegance, does not resolve all aspects of the mystery, because the reports about High Brazil were not limited to distant and fleeting sightings. In some of the most intriguing narratives that have come down to us, there were detailed descriptions of approaching, anchoring, and making contact with the land. There were people who claimed not only to have seen the island, but to have set foot on it. Among the accounts that most fueled popular and academic imagination over the centuries, a series of testimonies from the coastal communities of County Galway in Western Ireland stands out. Fishermen from different generations, with no apparent communication among themselves, described the island with remarkably similar characteristics. A land of fertile appearance, covered in vegetation, always sighted on foggy days or at dusk, and which dissolved into the mist before it could be fully reached. However, there were cases where the dissolution did not occur, cases where the approach was described as successful, and one such case, recorded in the latter half of the 17th century, was about to definitively change the debate surrounding High Brazil, not by offering definitive answers, but by adding a layer of detail and concreteness to the mystery that no previous account had achieved. The world sailed into the Atlantic with greater confidence with each passing generation. Maps became more accurate, instruments evolved, and yet High Brazil remained, resisting technical progress with the tranquility of one who knows they belong to a dimension that instruments cannot yet fully reach. The next chapter of this story would be narrated not by cartographers, but by a ship's captain who, according to the account that has reached us, finally touched the soil of that impossible land. The year was 1674. A ship departed from the coast of France bound for Ireland, captained by a man named John Nisbet, a native of Killybegs, a small port town in northwest Ireland. The crossing was routine, the kind Nisbet and his crew had made countless times. But at a certain point on the route, something unexpected happened. A dense fog closed in around the vessel, eliminating any visual reference on the horizon. When the mist slowly began to dissipate, what revealed itself before the crew was not the open horizon of the Atlantic, but the clear outline of a coast. According to the account that has reached us, Nisbet ordered the anchors dropped and sent a longboat with 4 men to investigate. The men disembarked and explored the island for a few hours. Upon their return, they brought back a description that would circulate through the ports and intellectual circles of Ireland and England in the following decades. A fertile land, with abundant vegetation, animals that showed no fear of the visitors, and, surprisingly, the presence of an elder who dwelled there. The man had apparently conversed with the crew members, though the original account did not specify the language or the exact content of these conversations. Nisbet's story reached the public in 1675, when an English writer named Richard Head published it in pamphlet form under the title O Brasil, or The Enchanted Island. Head's text was a deliberate mixture of reportage and literary narration, a popular genre at the time, and this made it difficult for later historians to accurately distinguish what was original testimony and what was the author's embellishment. But the core of the account, the unexpected approach, the landing and the encounter with an inhabitant, circulated widely and was cited by contemporaries as an event possessing some plausibility. Just a few years later, in 1684, the Irish antiquarian Roderick O'Flaherty published his work Ogygia, an extensive study on the history and geography of Ireland. Within this scholarly work, O'Flaherty included a deposition he had collected from a man named Murrow Olay from County Galway. According to Olay, he himself had been involuntarily taken to the island decades earlier, around 1640, and had remained there for some time before returning to Ireland. The deposition was rich in details about the island's landscape and nature, but like Nisbet's account, it left fundamental questions about the place's identity and the precise circumstances of the episode open. What makes these two accounts particularly interesting to scholars is not necessarily their literal truth, which remains impossible to verify. It is the narrative structure that both share. In both cases, access to the island is described as involuntary or accidental, mediated by adverse weather conditions such as fog. In both, the island presents itself as a place outside ordinary time, where the usual rules of experience seemed suspended. And in both, the return to the common world is described as an abrupt transition, as if the island had simply disappeared shortly after contact. This structure directly refers to the narrative patterns of Celtic traditions about the other world, the Gaelic set of beliefs concerning realms parallel to the human one, accessible only under specific circumstances, and always marked by a different temporal logic than ours. For scholars of Irish folklore, such as Lady Augusta Gregory and later Daithi O'Hogain, these accounts should not be read as lies or hallucinations, but as expressions of a worldview in which the boundary between the physical and the symbolic was genuinely porous. But there is a detail in this story that deserves special attention. Both Nisbet's and Olay's accounts were produced in a period when High Brazil still appeared on official maps. This means that the narrators and their listeners shared a common cartographic frame of reference. The island existed on the map, therefore it was possible for it to exist in the world. This circularity between record and testimony, between map and account, was precisely the mechanism that kept the island alive both in cartography and in collective memory. What was not yet clear, and would take centuries to be rigorously articulated, was the extent to which this circularity was conscious. To what extent the narrators knew they were constructing a narrative about a geographical entity that already possessed an established tradition. This question, which touches upon the boundaries between genuine experience and cultural construction, is one of the most intriguing threads in this entire story, and it will reappear in unexpected ways in the chapters yet to come. As the 18th century progressed, the European intellectual world was undergoing a profound transformation. The Enlightenment brought with it not only a new philosophy, but a new epistemological demand. Knowledge should be verifiable, replicable, and anchored in empirical observation. In this context, maps began to be revised with a rigor that previous generations had neither the instruments nor the inclination to apply, and it was in this process of systematic revision that High Brazil began to face, for the first time in more than 4 centuries, an organized and growing pressure for its definitive exclusion. Enlightenment cartographers progressively purged Atlantic maps of elements that could not be verified by recent expeditions. Islands that had appeared alongside High Brazil on medieval and Renaissance maps, such as the island of Antilha, the island of St. Brendan, and the legendary Satanaxio, were removed one by one as ships traversed their coordinates without finding anything. High Brazil resisted longer than most, perhaps due to the accumulated robustness of its accounts over centuries, perhaps due to a kind of cartographic inertia that delayed the moment of its definitive suppression. The turning point came in the second half of the 19th century. In 1865, British cartographers, working with the most up-to-date hydrographic data available, removed High Brazil from the official Admiralty nautical charts. The decision was not accompanied by any dramatic gesture, no solemn pronouncement. It was a bureaucratic act, almost silent. A line on a parchment that had survived for 5 centuries was simply not reproduced. And with that, for the practical purposes of modern navigation, the island ceased to exist. But history rarely ends so neatly. Because even after 1865, when official maps had closed the chapter on High Brazil, science was about to reveal something about the Atlantic seabed that would reopen the debate from an entirely new perspective. British hydrographic expeditions began to conduct detailed surveys of the ocean floor west of Ireland, and what they found was a geological formation of considerable proportions, known today as Porcupine Bank. The Porcupine Bank is an undersea plateau, a rise in the ocean floor located approximately 250 kilometers west of the Irish coast. Its geographical position is remarkably close to the coordinates where High Brazil was marked on most medieval and Renaissance maps. Under normal conditions, the top of this plateau lies about 200 meters below sea level, a depth sufficient to make it completely invisible to navigators. But it wasn't always like this, and it is precisely this caveat that changes everything. Geologists who studied the region throughout the 20th century arrived at a conclusion that added an unexpected dimension to the mystery. During the last glacial period, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, ocean levels were significantly lower than today. Conservative estimates indicate a difference of 100 to 120 meters. Under these conditions, the Porcupine Bank could have been partially above sea level, forming an island of considerable proportions in the Atlantic west of Ireland. Of course, it would be too much of a speculative leap to suggest that Celtic communities in Ireland possessed oral memories of a land that had existed tens of millennia earlier. But some researchers, working at the border between geology, archaeology, and folklore, have been exploring precisely this possibility, arguing that certain oral traditions of coastal peoples may preserve, in a transformed and symbolic way, memories of geographical changes that occurred in very remote periods of human history. This hypothesis is not a consensus in the scientific community, and it will probably never be verifiable with the available resources. But it illuminates something important about the nature of the High Brazil mystery. The island does not need to have existed as land accessible to medieval navigators for its presence on maps and in accounts to be explainable. It only needs to have existed in some form, at some time, for the trace of that existence to have endured in the deepest layers of a people's collective memory. And it is here that the story of High Brazil transcends the level of a cartographic curiosity to become something of greater reach. It confronts us with a question that goes far beyond medieval Ireland or Atlantic maps. What, after all, is a phantom island? An island that never existed, or an island that existed in a way we do not yet know how to name precisely? The answer, as we shall see in the final chapter, may be more revealing than any map has ever managed to express.